Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel. It's very famous and important and prolific. My name is Miss Knight. I am making these videos to provide Lord of the Flies readings to my students so they can read along with the book at home. I'm going to start with Chapter 1, The Sound of the Shell. The boy with fair hair lowered himself down the last few feet of rock and began to pick his way toward the lagoon. Though he had taken off his school sweater and trailed it now from one hand, his gray shirt stuck to him, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All around him, the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and broken trunks when a bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upwards with a witch-like cry, and this cry was echoed by another. "Hi," it said. "Wait a minute." The undergrowth at the side of the scar was shaken, and a multitude of raindrops fell pattering. "Wait a minute," the voice said. "I just got caught up." The fair boy stopped and jerked his stockings with an automatic gesture that made the jungle seem, for a moment, like the home countries. The voice spoke again. "I can't hardly move with all these creeper things." The owner of the voice came backing out of the undergrowth so that twigs scratched on a greasy windbreaker. The naked crooks of his knees were plump, caught and scratched by thorns. He bent down, removed the thorns carefully, and turned around. He was shorter than the fair boy and very fat. He came forward, searching out safe lodgments for his feet, and then looked up through the thick spectacles. "Where's the man with the megaphone?" The fair boy shook his head. "This is an island. At least, I think it's an island. That's a reef out in the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere." The fat boy looked startled. "There was that pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger cabin. He was up in front." The fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed-up eyes. "All them other kids," the fat boy went on. "Some of them must have got out. They must have, mustn't they?" The fair boy began to pick his way as casually as possible towards the water. He tried to be offhand and not too obviously uninterested, but the fat boy hurried after him. "Aren't there any grown-ups at all?" "I don't think so." The fair boy said this solemnly, but then the delight of a realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. "No grown-ups!" Okay, so I wanted to pause really quick and contrast these two characters. We have the fair boy and the fat boy, and both of those adjectives are really important to keep in mind. The fair boy is described that way because his hair is light in color, but it's also important to keep in mind an alternate meaning for the word fair. The word fair means just, like the teacher was fair to me or was not fair to me. And it's important to keep in mind if this boy, who we're going to be seeing a lot of, is in fact just, or if he is not. The fat boy as well, that is a defining characteristic of him, is that he is fat, with all of the assumptions and stereotypes that our society and that this society has about fat people. He is unathletic, he is awkward and obnoxious and in the way a lot. He follows the fair boy around, wanting to get attention and respect, and both of those descriptors are really important to their characters. The fat boy thought for a moment. "That pilot!" The fair boy allowed his feet to come down and sat on the steamy earth. "He must have flown off after he dropped us. He couldn't land here, not in a plane with wheels. We was attacked. He'll be back all right." The fat boy shook his head. "When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it." He looked up and down the scar. "And this is what the cabin done." So we know now that these boys have crash landed on this island. They are so far no grown-ups to be seen, and the crash of their plane has created this scar, this ditch in the dirt and the sand of the island where the plane has landed, and that the boys are now walking through. And it's you'll see soon that everything in this novel is symbolic and important, including this scar. So we have this island, which is, as you're going to see through future descriptions, paradise. It's perfect, it's beautiful, it's warm, the colors are gorgeous, it's heaven on earth. And humans have come and crashed our plane into it and made this scar, ruined it, made a mark on it. And that will continue to happen as the boys continue to live their life on the island. So definitely pay attention to the juxtaposition of the beautiful, perfect island and then the imperfections that the humans create on it. The fair boy reached out and touched the jagged end of a trunk. For a moment he looked interested. "What happened to it?" he asked. "Where's it got to now?" "That storm dragged it out to sea. It wasn't half dangerous with all them tree trunks falling. There must have been some kids still in it." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "What's your name?" "Ralph." The fat boy waited to be asked his name in turn, but this proffer of acquaintance was not made. The fair boy, called Ralph, smiled vaguely, stood up, and began to make his way once more towards the lagoon. The fat boy hung steadily at his shoulder. "I expect there's more of us scattered about. You haven't seen any others, have you?" Ralph shook his head and increased his speed. Then he tripped over a branch and came down with a crash. The fat boy stood by him, breathing hard. "My auntie told me not to run," he explained, "on account of my asthma." "Asthma?" "That's right. Can't catch my breath. I was the only boy in our school what had asthma," said the fat boy, with a touch of pride. "And I've been wearing specs since I was 3. He took off his glasses and held them out to Ralph, blinking and smiling, and then started to wipe them against his grubby windbreaker. An expression of pain and inward concentration altered the pale contours of his face. He smeared the sweat from his cheeks and quickly adjusted the spectacles on his nose. "Them fruit," he glanced around to the scar. "Them fruit," he said, "I expect—" He put on his glasses, waded away from Ralph, and crouched down among the tangled foliage. "I'll be out again in just a minute." So, if it's unclear, at this point the fat boy is experiencing some diarrhea from the fruit that he's eaten from the island. So we have, again, a lot of these negative stereotypes about fat people shown in this character. He has a weak digestive system, he gets tummy trouble, he wears glasses and has asthma. He's just very physically weak and not necessarily in a position to survive very well physically on this island. Contrast that to Ralph, who we're going to see here. Ralph disentangled himself cautiously and stole away through the branches. In a few seconds, the fat boy's grunts were behind him, and he was hurrying towards the screen that still lay between him and the lagoon. He climbed over a broken trunk and was out of the jungle. The shore was fledged with palm trees. These stood or leaned or reclined against the light, and their green feathers were 100 feet up in the air. The ground beneath them was a bank covered with coarse grass, torn everywhere by the upheavals of fallen trees, scattered with decaying coconuts and palm saplings. Behind this was the darkness of the forest proper, and the open space of the scar. Ralph stood, one hand against a gray trunk, and screwed up his eyes against the shimmering water. Out there, perhaps a mile away, the white surf flinked on a coral reef, and beyond that the open sea was dark blue. Within the irregular arc of coral, the lagoon was still as a mountain lake, blue of all shades in shadowy green and purple. The beach between the palm terrace and the water was a thin stick, endless apparently, for to Ralph's left the perspective of palm and beach and water drew to a point at infinity, and always, almost visible, was the heat. So again, the island is this paradise, this beautiful array of blues and greens and purples, a hot tropical island that I would love to take a vacation on in this cold February winter. He jumped down from the terrace. The sand was thick over his black shoes, and the heat hit him. He became conscious of the weight of clothes, kicked his shoes off fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with its elastic garter in a single movement. Then he leapt back on the terrace, pulled off his shirt, and stood there among the skull-like coconuts with the green shadows from the palms, and the forest sliding over his skin. He undid the snake clasp of his belt, lugged off his shorts and pants, which is British slang for underwear, and stood there naked, looking at the dazzling beach and the water. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of childhood, and not yet old enough for adolescence to have made him awkward. You could see now that he might make a boxer as far as width and heaviness of shoulders went, but there was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no devil. That is an important line. You should put a post-it by it. There was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no devil. The idea of the devil is going to be really important here, as is Ralph's supposed farness from this devilness, this devilishness. Definitely mark that. He patted the trunk softly and forced at last, to believe in the reality of the island, laughed delightedly again, and stood on his head. He turned neatly on his feet, jumped down to the beach, knelt and swept a double armful of sand into a pile against his chest. Then he sat back and looked at the water with bright, excited eyes. "Ralph!" The fat boy lowered himself over the terrace and sat down carefully, using the edge as a seat. "I'm sorry I've been such a time. Them fruit." He wiped his glasses and adjusted them on his button nose. The frame had made a deep pink V on the bridge. He looked critically at Ralph's golden body and then down at his own clothes. He laid a hand on the end of a zipper that extended down his chest. "My auntie." Then he opened the zipper with decision and pulled the whole windbreaker over his head. "There." Ralph looked at him sidelong and said nothing. "I expect we'll want to know all their names," said the fat boy, "and make a list. We ought to have a meeting." Ralph did not take the hint, so the fat boy was forced to continue. "I don't care what they call me," he said confidentially, "as long as they don't call me what they used to call me at school." Ralph was faintly interested. "What was that?" The fat boy glanced over his shoulder, then leaned towards Ralph. He whispered, "They used to call me Piggy." Ralph shrieked with laughter. He jumped up. "Piggy! Piggy!" "Ralph, please!" Piggy clasped his hands in apprehension. "I said I didn't want— Piggy! Piggy!" Ralph danced out into the hot air of the beach and then returned as a fighter plane with wings swept back and machine-gunned Piggy. "Shkow!" Presumably that's Ralph's machine gun noises. Do pay attention. You'll see guns and bombs and fighting as motifs in here, and they are pretty important to the plot. These are little boys. The world is at war. It's natural that they would be playing at war, but it's definitely significant, as you'll see as we continue. So Ralph has just machine gunned Piggy. He dived in the sand at Piggy's feet and lay there laughing. "Piggy!" Piggy grinned reluctantly, pleased despite himself at even this much recognition. Which is sad. That makes me sad. "So long as you don't tell the others." Ralph giggled into the sand. "Do you think he's going to tell the others?" The expression of pain and concentration returned to Piggy's face. "Half a sec." He hastened back into the forest. Ralph stood up and trotted along to the right. Here, the beach was interrupted abruptly by the square motif of the landscape. A great platform of pink granite thrust up uncompromisingly through forest and terrace and sand and lagoon to make a raised jetty 4 feet high. The top of this was covered with a thin layer of soil and coarse grass and shaded with young palm trees. There was not enough soil for them to grow to any height, and when they reached perhaps 20 feet, they fell and dried, forming a crisscross pattern of trunks, very convenient to sit on. The palms that stood still made a green roof, covered with on the other side, with a quivering tangle of reflections from the lagoon. Ralph hauled himself onto this platform, noted the coolness and shade, shut one eye, and decided that the shadows on his body were really green. He picked his way to the seaward edge of the platform and stood looking down into the water. It was clear to the bottom and bright with the efflorescence of tropical weed and coral. A school of tiny, glittering fish flickered hither and thither. Ralph spoke to himself, sounding the brass strings of delight. "Whizzo!" He's very British. Beyond the platform there was more enchantment. Some act of God, a typhoon perhaps, or the storm that had accompanied his own arrival, had banked sand inside the lagoon so that there was a long, deep pool in the beach with a high ledge of pink granite at the further end. Ralph had been deceived before now by the specious appearance of depth in a beach pool, and he approached this one preparing to be disappointed. But the island ran true to form, and the incredible pool, which clearly was only invaded by the sea at high tide, was so deep at one end as to be dark green. Ralph inspected the whole 30 yards carefully, and then plunged in. The water was warmer than his blood, and he might have been swimming in a huge bath. Piggy appeared again at the rocky ledge and watched Ralph's green and white body enviously. You can't half swim. That's British slang. He means that he can swim very well. Piggy! Piggy took off his shoes and socks, ranged them carefully on the ledge, and tested the water with one toe. It's hot. What did you expect? I didn't expect nothing. My auntie sucks to your auntie. Ralph did a surface dive and swam underwater with his eyes open. The sandy edge of the pool loomed up like a hillside. He turned over, holding his nose, and a golden light danced and shattered just over his face. Piggy was looking determined and began to take off his shorts. Presently, he was palely and fatly naked. He tiptoed down the sandy side of the pool and sat there up to his neck in water, smiling proudly at Ralph. Aren't you going to swim? Piggy shook his head. I can't swim. I wasn't allowed. My asthma sucks to your asthma. Piggy bore this with a sort of humble patience. You can't half swim well. Again, it's a compliment. Ralph paddled backwards down the slope, immersed his mouth, and blew a jet of water into the air. Then he lifted his chin and spoke. I could swim when I was 5. Daddy taught me. He's a commander in the Navy. When he gets leave, he'll come and rescue us. What's your father? Piggy flushed suddenly. My dad's dead, he said quickly, and my mom. He took off his glasses and looked vainly for something with which to clean them. I used to live with my auntie. She kept a candy store, and I used to get ever so many candies, as many as I liked. When will your dad rescue us? Soon as he can. Piggy rose, dripping from the water, and stood naked, cleaning his glasses with a sock. The only sound that reached them now through the heat of the morning was the long, grinding roar of the breakers on the reef. How does he know we're here? Ralph lolled in the water. Sleep enveloped him like the swathing images that were wrestling with the brilliance of the lagoon. How does he know we're here? Because, thought Ralph, because. The roar from the reef became very distant. They'd tell him at the airport. Piggy shook his head, put on his flashing glasses, and looked down at Ralph. Not them. Didn't you hear what the pilot said about the atom bomb? They're all dead. Ralph pulled himself out of the water, stood facing Piggy, and considered this unusual problem. Piggy persisted. This is an island, isn't it? I climbed a rock, said Ralph slowly, and I think this is an island. They're all dead, said Piggy, and this is an island. Nobody don't know we're here. Your dad don't know. Nobody don't know. His lips quivered, and the spectacles were dimmed with mist. We may stay here until we die. With that word, the heat seemed to increase until it became a threatening weight, and the lagoon attacked them with a blinding effulgence. So stopping here, there's a couple things to note here. One, we get some backstory as to why they're on this island. We can kind of extrapolate, since this book was written after World War II, from what children in England were doing it during World War II. So during the bombing, the German bombing of London and of England, many kids were taken to the country or even left England entirely for safety. If you were a fan of the Chronicles of Narnia series, they go to their uncle's house in the country because of the bombing of London in order to avoid that, and that's how they find Narnia. So we can assume that these boys were all on this plane to escape the damage and the danger of whatever war is going on, and that the air traffic controllers or whoever on the ground the pilot was talking to has been bombed and is dead, and so people don't know where they are. The fact that there's a war going on in the world outside of the island is really important to keep in mind when we evaluate the way that the boys are behaving, and the way that the adults in the world are behaving, and whether the adults are behaving any better than the children are. The other thing I wanted to point out here is right after P suggests that they might die on this island, the first thing Ralph says and the first thing he wants is his clothes. And I want to point out to you guys the importance of the theme of society and civilization versus nature and savagery. The first thing Ralph wants to do on this island is strip off his clothes and stand on his head and run around and just like have a good time with no grown-ups. But once he understands that there might be a danger here that he hasn't taken into account, the first thing he wants is his clothing. And once he puts on his shirt, it says that to put it back on is strangely pleasing. He's finding comfort in societal norms like wearing clothing because society is comforting and safe. And that is a huge thing to keep track of as we read the book. Okay, so moving on. "Get my clothes," muttered Ralph. "Along there." He trotted through the sand, enduring the sun's enmity, crossed the path, and found his scattered clothes. To put on a gray shirt once more was strangely pleasing. Then he climbed the edge of the platform and sat in the green shade on a convenient trunk. Piggy hauled himself up, carrying most of his clothes under his arms. Then he sat carefully on a fallen trunk near the little cliff that fronted the lagoon, and the tangled reflections quivered over him. Presently he spoke. "We got to find the others. We got to do something." Ralph said nothing. Here was a coral island, protected from the sun. Ignoring Piggy's ill-omened talk, he dreamed pleasantly. Piggy insisted. "How many of us are there?" Ralph came forward and stood by Piggy. "I don't know." Here and there, little breezes crept over the polished water, beneath the haze of heat. When these breezes reached the platform, the palm fronds would whisper, so that spots of blurred sunlight slid over their bodies or moved like bright, winged things in the shade. Piggy looked up at Ralph. All the shadows on Ralph's face were reversed, green above, bright below from the lagoon. A blur of sunlight was crawling across his hair. "We got to do something." Ralph looked through him. Here at last was the imagined but never fully realized place leaping into real life. Ralph's lips parted in a delighted smile, and Piggy, taking the smile to himself as a mark of recognition, laughed with pleasure. "If this really is an island, what's that?" Ralph had stopped smiling and was pointing into the lagoon. Something creamy lay among the ferny weeds. A stone? No, a shell. Suddenly Piggy was abubble with decorous excitement. "That's right, it's a shell. I seen one like that before, on someone's back wall. A conch, he called it. He used to blow it, and then his mum would come. It's ever so valuable." Near to Ralph's elbow, a palm sapling leaned out over the lagoon. Indeed, the weight was already pulling a lump from the poor soil, and soon it would fall. He tore out the stem and began to poke about in the water, while the brilliant fish flicked away on this side and that. Piggy leaned in dangerously. "Careful, you'll break it." "Shut up." Ralph spoke absently. The shell was interesting and pretty and a worthy plaything, but the vivid phantoms of his daydream still interposed between him and Piggy, who in this context was an irrelevance. The palm sapling, bending, pushed the shell across the weeds. Ralph used one hand as a fulcrum and pressed down with the other till the shell rose, dripping, and Piggy could make a grab. Now the shell was no longer a thing seen but not to be touched. Ralph became excited. Piggy babbled. "A conch, ever so expensive. I bet if you wanted to buy one, you'd have to pay pounds and pounds and pounds. He had it on his garden wall, and my auntie—" Ralph took the shell from Piggy, and a little water ran down his arm. In color, the shell was deep cream, touched here and there with fading pink. Between the point, worn away into a little hole, and the pink lips of the mouth, lay 18 inches of shell, with a slight spiral twist, and covered with a delicate, embossed pattern. Ralph shook sand out of the deep tube. "Mooed like a cow," he said. "He had some white stones, too, and a bird cage with a green parrot. He didn't blow the white stones, of course, and he said—" Piggy paused for breath, and stroked the glistening thing that lay in Ralph's hands. "Ralph!" Ralph looked up. "We can use this to call the others. Have a meeting. They'll come when they hear us." He beamed at Ralph. "That was what you meant, didn't you? That's why you got the conch out of the water." You guys, is that why Ralph got the conch out of the water? No, it's not. He just wanted to play with it. Piggy, again, is showing real intelligence. He's showing that he knows how to use things to get what he needs and get what needs to be done, which is gather the group of boys and make sure that everybody is safe, everybody has what they need, and figure out a plan. Ralph is not thinking of that. Ralph just wants to play. Ralph pushed back his fair hair. "How did your friend blow the conch?" "He kind of spat," said Piggy. "My auntie wouldn't let me blow, on account of my asthma. He said you blew from down here." Piggy laid a hand on his jutting abdomen. "You try, Ralph. You'll call the others." Doubtfully, Ralph laid the small end of the shell against his mouth and blew. There came a rushing sound from its mouth, but nothing more. Ralph wiped the salt water off his lips and tried again, but the shell remained silent. "He kind of spat." Ralph pursed his lips and squirted air into the shell, which emitted a low, farting noise. This amused both boys so much that Ralph went on squirting for some minutes, between bouts of laughter. He blew from down here. Ralph grasped the idea and hit the shell with air from his diaphragm. Immediately the thing sounded. A deep, harsh note boomed under the palms, spread through the intricacies of the forest, and echoed back from the pink granite of the mountain. Clouds of birds rose under the treetops, and something squealed and ran in the undergrowth. Ralph took the shell away from his lips. Gosh! His ordinary voice sounded like a whisper after the harsh note of the conch. He laid the conch against his lips, took a deep breath, and blew once more. The note boomed again, and then, at his firmer pressure, the note, fluking up an octave, became a strident blare, more penetrating than before. Piggy was shouting something, his face pleased, his glasses flashing. The birds cried, small animals scuttered. Ralph's breath failed. The note dropped the octave, became a low whubber, was a rush of air. The conch was silent, a gleaming tusk. Ralph's face was dark with breathlessness, and the air over the island was full of bird clamor and echoes ringing. I bet you can hear that for miles.